I'm Michael Burnette. I'm AF7KB, and I'm the author of these books that you see up here, as well as a bunch of other supporting material. And I'm the narrator of our audio programs as well. Now, if you are a grizzled veteran of the HF bands, and your ham shack's walls are covered with QSL cards and DX awards and worked all states and worked all counties and all that stuff, you're in the wrong room. You need to go find another presentation, because this is going to be very basic stuff. It's not going to be anything new for you here. For the rest of you, my plan is to spend about the next 49 and a half minutes going over some practical basics about getting into HF operation. We're going to talk about building your first HF station. We'll touch on some HF modes and operating procedures, and we're going to start with building a station and some of the choices that are ahead of you. I think it's safe to say that there are no two amateur radio stations, HF stations anyway, that are exactly alike. Every one of them is unique. I mean, I was in commercial radio for many years. I can walk into any radio station, even today, with all their new digital stuff, and I operate that radio station because I know how a basic radio station works. It's not really that complicated. But amateur stations are very unique. And as you all probably know, you can do some serious damage if you do the wrong thing at the wrong time. Oh, I'll just switch on 2 antennas. No, you won't. Not for long. So every one of them is unique, and they're created in response to the ham's operating goals, the operating site, really kind of an overwhelming consideration in a lot of cases, and of course, the ham's budget. Sometimes they're also the product of what I'll call ham lore. That's the polite term. That's the misinformation that you find all over those fountains of wisdom known as Facebook and YouTube. Some quick basics. When we talk about HF, we're talking about the high frequency bands, those below the 6 meter band. Primarily, those are 160 meters through 10 meters. There are a couple more bands way down there below 160 meters, but for the moment, those are primarily experimental, and you're not going to find them on commercial HF radios. There is, by the way, a booth here of a guy, and I wish I remembered his company's name, but he has adapters so that your transmitter can transmit on those super low bands. So, and a nice low-pass filter so that you're not messing up the AM broadcast channels when you do that. I was pretty impressed that you could go out now and get commercial stuff for those bands. Last year, you couldn't do that. You had to build it all yourself. So now, I also know that when we talk about the 160 meter band, technically we should call it the MF, medium frequency band. But in ham use, it's 160 through 10, and that's HF. So, the HF bands are the worldwide communication bands, at least on good propagation days. They propagate over long distances. Sometimes they're not worth anything over short distances, but they go over long distances. And that's mostly with the help of the ionosphere. The condition of the ionosphere varies with the condition of course, the sun. For us, the best indicator of the condition of the sun is the presence or absence of sunspots. More sunspots equals usually better propagation. Now, we got a little carried away a week or so back. We had a G5 geomagnetic storm, and a big old solar flare blew up on the sun, and that blew up our ionosphere, and it was wild. I mean, HF propagation went from fantastic to nothing in a matter of like an hour. I mean, it was nothing. There was nothing but static out there for a while. So, it can be too much of a good thing, but generally speaking, more sunspots is better propagation. Those sunspots vary on a 22-year cycle, so every 11 years we get a peak. You've probably heard we have been for some time in one of the valleys of the sunspot cycle, for a long time. You may have even heard that the HF bands are dead. Well, first, some good news. No matter what you may have heard, the bands are not dead. In fact, we've been enjoying some really nice propagation conditions for the past few months. So they're not dead, they just smell a little funny. It's true that we were in the bottom, or maybe just past the bottom of the sunspot cycle. And it's also true that HF propagation has not been what it will be when we hit the peak of this sunspot cycle. However, there have been a lot of days, even in the depths of the valley at my shack, when I couldn't hear anything, and all of a sudden I could hear something. So far as I know, the ARRL, all through the Sunspot Valley, never stopped sending out those DXCC awards. So somebody was getting some propagation somewhere. It's almost always possible to make a contact if you are willing to work hard enough at it. That's that DXCC. They just kept sending them out. Now here's a recent propagation forecast, and you've probably seen this. You can see this was not a great day for propagation on any band above 40 meters. And yet, here's a map at the very same time. This is off dxmaps.com. And that's that same morning, we're looking at contacts reported on the 20-meter band. That's certainly well above 40 meters. So there's plenty of fun to be had on the HF bands, even on bad propagation days. And it does not take the 100-foot tower festooned with exotic and expensive antennas connected to the world's greatest radio to get in on the HF action. Getting on the HF bands vastly expands your ham radio world. It expands it geographically, and it expands it operationally. On HF, there is a wider variety of activities. Obviously, there's CW, which is enjoying quite a renaissance, and single sideband phone, and lots of it. And there's also quite a selection of HF digital modes, some of which have become enormously popular and controversial, at least for the moment, in response to propagation conditions. Now, you can have interesting conversations with people all over the world, or you can go for awards that are pure how many contacts can I make, like Worked All States or DX Century Club. And there are lots of contests of all sorts. I mean, it's rare to find a weekend that doesn't have some kind of contest going on. If you enjoy nets, there are plenty of them to choose from all across the bands. Now, each band tends to take on its own character, kind of its own flavor. And that's partly because of how the frequencies are affected by propagation conditions, and partly just by the semi-random assortment of folks who've chosen to hang out on those bands. Sometimes it's technical considerations. I just finished going through CW Academy, which is put on by the CW Ops folks. And our teacher was a fellow in Northern Ireland, Roger. You will not find Roger anywhere except one particular frequency on 15 meters. That is because Roger has a perfectly resonant long wire antenna in his backyard that is set to that frequency, and he works nothing but QRP. And he's one of these guys that, you know, he's on talking with somebody, and he goes, how many watts are you running? 5 watts. Well, let's try 4. You know, and so he was telling us he had worked Germany from Northern Ireland with 1 watt. Both of them had 1 watt. He says it's getting pretty hard to hear, but so that's a game you can play on HF. Let's see. So the question is, what do you want to do on the HF bands? Well, Mr. Burnette, Mr. Big-Time Author, I don't know. That's kind of why I came to your presentation. I get it. It's a big smorgasbord of stuff, and it's kind of hard to know where to jump in. You don't know what you're going to enjoy and what you're not going to enjoy when you're looking from the outside. So, you know about FT8, and when I heard of that, probably like a lot of you, I thought, this is the single stupidest thing I've ever heard of in my life. This is ridiculous. You know, here I sit at my computer and I can get my call sign and the signal report and, you know, a location and 7.3. That's it. That's all I can transmit, and that's all I can get from them. Come on. Who are we kidding? This is a joke. But I write ham radio books, so I had to explore it. So I set up my little laptop at the radio, and I plug it in, and I start working FT8. And 2 hours later, my wife says, "Are we going to have dinner or what?" It was a blast. It was really fun to just sit there and knock down contacts as fast as you could. So I had no idea. I thought it'd be just a complete bore, and instead I got really hooked on it. Let's see, where was I? I fired up an old, which by the way, it was an old laptop I was running. It's running Windows 7. Okay, so you don't need any fancy computer equipment if you want to play in the HF digital modes. It's going real slow. Now, for you, you're starting off on your journey. Let's think in terms of a station that will let you experiment with a lot of HF modes and find out what lights you up, what's fun for you. And let's add to that, too, that we do this at a reasonably modest level of expense and inconvenience. So you're not in over your head before you even get started. Now, when I say modest expense, I mean by the time you finish building this thing, and it'll be a good station, you'll have a lot less into it than my son-in-law and son, shown here, with their fancy bicycles and fancy riding gear, their shorts and their jerseys and their helmets and the special tires and the hoodies. There's no end to it. Believe me, for what these yahoos have in their equipment, you could build 2 really good HF stations. So we're going to do it at a modest expense, but friends, it's not going to be free, okay? You got to have a few bucks in your pocket to get into this thing. By the way, I know what those guys spent on those bicycles, so I'm not just making stuff up. Now, let's specify that for you, this is going to be a station capable of operating multiple bands, and since it's well within reach, let's aim for something from 80 meters through 10 meters. 160 meters is kind of a specialized thing. It takes some special antennas and all that stuff. So we're going to set that one aside for later, although we're not going to rule it out completely. Let's go with modest power, say 100 watts. QRP, that low power operation, is a tough place to start. You want to develop some expertise probably before you jump into that. So that can be kind of challenging, although it's a great branch of the hobby. Something very appealing to me. I don't know why, but it is. QRO, the opposite, high power operation, is something that can be a lot of fun. You buy the big amplifier, you wire up the shack for 220, crank that baby up, fills the air with ozone. It's kind of wonderful, but that can come later. When you have your antenna and your operating skills sorted out, because the truth is that high power amplifier is not going to do you a lot of good until you have a good antenna and some good operating skills. And we'll talk more about transceivers, but with those parameters, there are lots of radios over there in the exhibit halls that will work just fine and do it at a reasonably modest cost. Just about any mainstream all-mode HF transceiver is going to fill the bill for you if it was made in the last 2 decades. Farther back than that, you'll find radios that don't do what they call the work bands, like 17 meters and like that. So you won't have the same selection of bands on those radios, although they will work just fine. All right, your HF antenna. Any experienced HF operator is going to tell you this is the single most important piece of equipment in your whole station. To some extent, I said, your choice of HF antenna will inevitably be dictated by the space that's available to install it and other issues related to that space. So if you have a whole bunch of acreage, okay, few acres of land, a lot of very tall trees, no neighbors around for miles, no homeowners association to deal with, and an unlimited budget, I want to come live with you. Wait a minute, no. You have a lot more possibilities than someone on a tight budget in a rented apartment with no land and a landlord who is rabidly anti-antenna. So if you have the space and some tall trees or something else to hang a long wire antenna, that's where you want to start. That's absolutely what I'd recommend for your starter. And it can be a fantastic antenna. Remember I was talking about Roger, who worked Germany from Northern Ireland on 1 watt? That's a long wire antenna. That's all he has. You can buy commercial versions of several popular designs. If you're even a little bit handy, they're simple enough to construct. And I won't say they're effortless to put up, but they aren't major construction projects, okay? You're not going to be calling the concrete pumper truck in order to put up a long wire antenna. They're also pretty stealthy. You have to look pretty hard to see them at all. We do a fan dipole for our field day setup for our club. And when we have visitors, I have to walk them out and go, it's right up there, see? Oh, that's an antenna. I mean, it's invisible because it's just a thin wire across the sky. Now, I'm not saying that anyone could sneak this past an HOA. I would certainly never in a million years advocate that you violate your HOA contract. Just saying, it's pretty stealthy. Long wires strung in trees can have about 3 basic configurations. There are flat tops, slopers, and inverted V's. The flat topper looks like a lot of the pictures in your license training manuals. It's a more or less horizontal wire. In this one, the feed point's in the center, but it could be at either end or even at a place somewhere between the center and the end, and all those different connections change the performance of the antenna, often dictated by convenience. This person's shack happens to be near the center of the antenna, and so they're using a center-fed dipole. A sloper runs from a lower spot to a higher spot. Usually that works out to be from the eaves of your house or your ham shack up to some tall object, often a tree. Again, this could be center-fed, off-center fed, end-fed, whatever. I think most slopers are end-fed. An inverted V runs from a lower spot to a higher spot and back down to a lower spot. And these are end-fed, off-center fed, or center-fed, depending on the design. There are a few multi-band long wire designs for you to choose from. Now, one popular one is called the G5RV. You can buy these ready-made from several sources. This one happens to be from the late lamented MFJ. They probably still have some in the warehouse. They got a lot of sales going on right now. Or you can make yourself one with some wire, some insulators, a length of ladder line, which you may find challenging to locate. You can build it yourself. And it's also known as window line. And a choke ballon. That's that thing right there. This doesn't work. Right here in the center. That's the ballon. That's what makes the impedances work between your transmitter and this antenna. You do need an antenna tuner to make a G5RV work. And most likely that's going to be an external tuner. A lot of new radios have tuners built into them, but they're usually pretty limited in the amount of SWR they can deal with. Usually around 3 to 1, and they're out of gas. So you might need an external tuner, but they aren't terribly expensive. A full-size G5RV is 102 feet long. The center needs to be at least 35 feet off the ground. That's not bad. There are some antennas that need to be a lot higher, but this one works okay at 35 feet off the ground. You can set it up as an inverted V or a sloper, or as a horizontal. The lowest parts, again, need to be at least 25 feet. So if you make it a V, those ends need to be at least 25 feet above the ground. And as with just about any antenna, this is as close to a universal truth as there is in ham radio: higher is better. So if you can get that center point up 100 feet, go for it. It'll make the radiation pattern better, and it'll be a lot easier to tune. Now, one more long wire: if you have a huge chunk of land with several tall objects near the perimeter, you might consider a horizontal loop. You'll need 3 or 4 or more good-sized, say 40 feet tall or more, trees or other tall things on your property that are spaced a healthy distance apart. The length of the antenna is one wavelength of the lowest frequency for which you are building it. So if you have room to string out about 160 meters, 550 feet of wire, you can have an antenna that will work 160 meters through 6 meters. Yeah, you can even get in on some 6-meter action with this. They're very quiet, too. I have a friend who he's got a really nice tower with a tri-bander up at the top, and a few years back he put up a horizontal loop. It's a crank-up tower. He hasn't cranked that tower up since. He just works nothing but that horizontal loop. He loves it because it's so quiet. He's a CW operator. All right, we're aiming for 80 meters or up, so you'd be thinking about 275 feet of wire for one that would go down to 80 meters. The horizontal loop is not terribly picky about its exact shape. You can do a square, you can do a rectangle, you can even do a triangle. The idea is to enclose as much space with that loop as you possibly can. It isn't picky about height either, which is really good news. Higher is better, but I have read reports of people making these and installing them as low as 10 feet high, and they work. Now, are there more long wire antenna designs? Absolutely. You can buy a whole book of them, and the ARRL will be very pleased to take your money for them. But given the parameters that we've chosen, is it worth spending days and days researching those antennas? Are you going to find some magic antenna that's better than the ones I've described? No, you're not. It's an antenna. It's gonna antenna, and it's gonna have certain limitations, and it's gonna have certain strengths, and that's about it. So, yes, by all means, learn as much as you can, but don't go crazy researching. Go crazy operating. All right. Like I say, by all means, learn about them. I'm not going to say I discourage your learning, but don't get hung up on the learning part. Remember, we came here to do radio. You can optimize your setup later when you really know where you want to focus. One of our repeated, subliminal suggestions in our books is optimum is optional in ham radio. Okay? Once you get that through your head, you will have more fun in this hobby than I can begin to describe. But as long as you're hung up on I have to have the perfect station, it's not going to be great. So optimum is optional. The basics of putting up long wires are pretty simple. Your objective is simply to safely get a hunk or two of wire up high in the air as far as you can, separated from the supports by insulators. The ends should be supported by non-conductive material, usually a length of rope. You want to rig the ends on some sort of system that lets you lower and raise that antenna easily, because no matter how good your tape measure is, you're not going to cut it right the first time. You're going to put it up, you're going to tune it, then you're going to drop it, and you're going to adjust as necessary. If you're using a tree or two, there are a number of ways to get those support ropes up in the upper reaches of the tree. None of them involves you fantasizing that you are a tree climber. Okay, there are really fun and easy ways to do this. You can use a fishing rod. Okay, tie a good old lead weight on it, as far as you can, up over the tree. If it gets hung up, and it will, that's why you brought extra weights for your fishing rod. Okay, you use that line to pull up a stouter rope, and then the stouter rope pulls the antenna up. People have been known to tie some fishing line to a bow and arrow and get the job done. It's probably a good time to say safety first when you consider this. One of our members was using our pneumatic air gun one time to fire a weight and did a beautiful shot over the top of the tree and dropped it right on the cop car that was right over there. That was an interesting conversation. Our favorite, though, is that air-powered gun like this one. This is advertised regularly in the back of QST or online, and it fires a spherical fishing weight. It's a device that honestly should not be as much fun as it is. If you're putting up a very temporary installation, you can use something as crude as nylon packing twine to secure the ends of your long wire. For something more permanent, you're going to want some Dacron rope that's rated for exterior use. Now, be sure to hang the antenna so there's some slack. You don't want it taut when the wind starts to blow. Even though it's just a little skinny wire, it's a pretty good sail by the time you get, a couple hundred feet of it up there. A lot of times when I tell people who are new to this hobby about how to put up a long wire antenna, they listen to this and they kind of give me this look like, yeah, and? It's like there's no and, that's it. You hang the wire up there, remember to attach your feed line before you raise it for the last time, and away you go, that's it. It really can be that simple. Here's our club putting together our field operation. This happens to be for a contest called 7QP. One of our favorite field antennas is that fan dipole. It does 80, 40, and 20 meters. And with some helpers, it takes less than an hour to set up the whole thing from the moment the antenna comes out of the box. Less than an hour. If we had fewer helpers, it would probably take even less time, but now, a little hint for any of you who are in ham clubs, and if you're not in a ham club, we have to talk afterwards because you're missing some of the biggest fun in the hobby. A little hint for you, you can accomplish a huge amount of antenna building in a very short time with a couple of 16-inch pizzas and a cooler full of beverages. Whether adult or not is up to you and your club. Now, is there nothing tall around your house? Does it look like that? I'm in the same boat, believe it or not. Even though I live in Washington State, I have no tall trees that are worth hanging an antenna on, so I got nothing. Wire antenna is not going to happen for me. However, I do have a decent-sized backyard, so we've put up a vertical. This happens to be a 0.5 43-foot vertical. It's not mine. I can't get a decent picture of mine, but that's in some guy's yard down in Florida, and he let me use the picture. It is possible to home brew a vertical antenna, but I'm going to tell you right now, there's no getting around the fact that they have more difficult engineering problems to solve, and that's both electronic engineering and mechanical or civil engineering, and they have to stand up. I mean, they got to stand up in a strong windstorm, so they got to have some stiffness to them. By the time you scare up all the various parts you need to assemble a multiband vertical, in most cases, you'd be way better off just busting out your credit card and ordering one. They'll ship it to you, it comes off the truck, and you're in business. By the way, by simply ordering a commercially made one, you have a manufacturer backing you up. When you don't quite put it together right, they can real easily tell you, oh, you need to take section 2 and 3 and separate them a little more, whatever. Now, here's a high-gain DX88. This is not 43 feet tall, this is 25 feet tall. It covers 80 through 10 meters. Now, I just had a chance to see one of these in action. We had it going for one of our club days, and to compare it on several bands with a dipole and with a tri-bander Yagi that was up on a tall tower. The DX88 was a little noisier. It certainly held its own. At times, it was outperforming the dipole. That was working off about 20 ground radials that we had strung out on the ground. We didn't bury them or anything like that. We tied the ends to tent stakes. It was a field operation, so, again, they're just laying on the ground. If you were putting this in your backyard, you could bury the radial wires. You're almost always going to have radial wires with a vertical antenna. Or you can just use turf staples as you string those wires out, and your grass will grow up and cover them up. Now, here's a radial plate that goes at the base of a vertical antenna to connect all those radial wires. I own one of these, and that's what we use at the base of our vertical. At DX88 we were using was ground mounted. Other HF verticals you can mount on your roof. And there are at least a couple of HF verticals that advertise that they don't require radials. This is a Cushcraft R8. Scuttlebutt on the internet, I haven't tested this, is that even those work better if you can string out some ground plane across the top of your roof. That brings us to the topic of stealth antennas. There are still plenty of zoning ordinances and homeowners association regulations out there that forbid or at least drastically limit our ability to put up various sorts of antennas, if we can put up any antenna at all. However, there is still hope. There are lots and lots of ideas on the web for stealth antennas. There's a whole book of them that the League sells, and here are a few of the more common solutions. By the way, again, far be it from me to suggest that you act in some underhanded way or deceptive way in order to skirt or evade these important rules that are, of course, saving our neighborhoods, which have no other problems. So let's just say this section is presented for entertainment purposes only. Most towns and HOAs don't forbid flagpoles. That would be unpatriotic, right? Well, look very closely at this handsome flagpole in this gentleman's front yard, and you might see some suspicious lumps. Those lumps are coils and traps. That's 05 Antenna's 30-foot flagpole antenna. And you can see it actually flies a flag, and it comes with all the flag hardware. That covers 80 through 10 meters. It does take some radials strung out, but you can, sneak those in at night, maybe. Again, for entertainment purposes only. If you have some long lengths of plastic rain gutter around your home, you can sneak an end-fed half-wave wire antenna into the gutters, even if it has to turn a corner or two. If you have aluminum gutters, well, I know for a fact that there is a set of aluminum gutters in my neighborhood that's radiating down to 40 meters. It may take a little ingenuity, but it absolutely can be done. I don't know if you can tell on this picture, but there's a feed point. This is the bottom of the gutter, bottom of the rain stuff that comes down. That's the fellow's feed point. No, I won't give you his address. You say you live in a high-rise apartment or condo. If there's a balcony, you can stick a ham stick or a screwdriver antenna, or you could dangle some 14-gauge wire down the side of the building for a counterpoise, and away you go. Now, you're not going to be a big gun contest station, okay? Across from our booth, there's a fellow who owns 10 Tech, and he has this ranch with an antenna farm on it, and you can go to his place and do your DXCC in a weekend, he told us. I've never done it, but he told us that's possible. That's not going to be you if you're operating this antenna off your your apartment balcony. But you'll be operating, you'll be making contacts. Do you have a big attic? You can stick a long wire up there. It won't be optimum, but optimum is what? Optional. It can work so long as everything is wood up there. Now, if you happen to have a tin roof, you're out of luck on this one. Your signal's not going to get through that. If you go the attic antenna route, please remember your antenna is carrying some very high voltage, particularly out there at the ends, so observe proper precautions. The League publishes a whole book of stealth antennas. It's well worth the investment if it saves your house from burning down. Now, there's also magnetic loop antennas, and you'll find several vendors of those in the exhibit halls over there. This one's from Alpha Antennas. There are others. They're pretty easy to build for yourself, right up to the moment that you try to find that heavy-duty, high-voltage capacitor, variable capacitor, that's in the little box at the bottom of that. Those, I understand, are extraordinarily hard to scare up. So, probably better off just buying commercially. The rest of that antenna is just a couple of lengths of coax. Only the shields of the coax are conducting. The center conductor is just coming along for the ride. The signal goes to the small loop, and that induces a signal in the large loop, and you tune the big capacitor for minimum SWR. You're radiating. It's kind of inconvenient. Every time you change frequency, you have to retune this thing, and they're not the most efficient antenna in the world, but they work. And as hundreds of de-expeditions have found out, they can work very well. If you have internet access and no hope of even getting a radio, much less putting up an antenna, you can still play on the HF bands. Just need a couple of pieces of the right equipment and or software, and you can operate a rig remotely, such as a club rig. A friend of mine has been a ham since 1951. I'm old, and I was born in 1951, and he's been a ham since 1951. He recently moved into a situation where he had no hope of putting up an antenna. No problem. He joined a San Francisco Bay Area organization and works remotely. Now, he works CW. It's easier to work CW than to work voice, just because there's lag in the internet, so your voice kind of loses some of that immediacy, but it can be done. And you can certainly do FT8 contacts or things like that. Remote only requires that you have a laptop or computer connected to the internet, and it doesn't have to be a supercomputer. I'm not going to go into all the intricacies of setting up a remote control system, because there are a lot of ways to skin that cat, but it's real easy to find them on the internet. There are commercial programs that'll do it, and there's also some freebie stuff out there that you can make work. Probably better off with the commercial stuff, though. Now, obviously, the radio being controlled has to be set up to be remote controlled, but those are easy to find. Here's a typical remote operation interface, and you can see it looks pretty much like your average transceiver. So the software talks to an interface of some sort at the other end, and the interface talks to the remote controlled radio, and away you go. Now, before we go radio shopping, let's talk briefly about your feed line. What I'm about to say borders on ham lore heresy, so brace yourself or shield your ears if you can't hear heresy or whatever. But if you're going to collapse or something when I say this, just try to ignore it. It's perfectly possible to have a working feed line made out of that RG6 75 ohm coaxial line that your cable repairman left behind when he installed your system. Or, you know, that reel of cable stuff, cable TV stuff that you bought at Home Depot. Can work perfectly well. I know, we told you in the license manuals never to do that, but it can work. However, you're going to spend $30 at Home Depot for that roll of coax. But that means you're going to get a 1.5 to 1 SWR. Ha! Horrors! 1.5 to 1 SWR translates to 0.18 dB of loss. 0.18 dB. That's about 4% of your power. If the rest of your antenna system, is well matched to 75 ohms, which will take some work, you're probably getting more signal to your antenna with that than half the HF operators at this convention. However, by the time you buy some conduit in which to install that feed line, because it's not waterproof, and you buy the connectors and the matching gear that you're going to need at the antenna end, you're going to be into that deal for at least 70 or 80 bucks, at least. Our friends over here at DX Engineering will quite happily make you a 100-foot length of their 400 max, low-loss, double-shielded coax, really nice stuff, complete with professionally installed PL259s on either end for $119.99. So for 40 bucks, you're into excellence instead of, I worked really hard to make it work. And you have a lot fewer parts in the system. So that stuff is double shielded, it's direct buriable, you don't have to buy any conduit, and it only loses 0.8 dB per 100 feet at 30 megahertz. If you remember to order some waterproofing goop for your connectors at the same time that you're ordering the coax, you'll get free shipping on that too. Now I imagine Gigaparts and HRO will make you the same deal perfectly cheerfully on similar products. If you have a shorter run than 100 feet, you'll get it handled for even less. There's the small matter of how that feed line gets into your ham shack. Now, of course, you can go with the time-honored drill a hole in the wall and run the coax into a junction box with a PL238 bulkhead on the front. Now, some folks don't feel comfortable with drilling and sawing holes in their walls, so for them, there is a clever solution. I hope this solution is going to exist from some other manufacturer, because this one I'm going to show you comes from MFJ, and if you haven't heard, they're going out of business. Might be able to scare one up still, though. What you're looking at is the exterior side of the panel. The interior looks the same. Now that panel comes mounted on a cedar board. And you cut that board to length, and you put it in your window, whether it's a vertical or a horizontal opening window. You just cut it to size, close the window, probably stick a dowel in there to keep the window locked if it's a horizontal slider, and it makes a pass-through for all your stuff. Easy as can be. About as fast as you can measure and saw and shut the window on it, you've got a weatherproof, bug-proof feed-through for your feed line, and you didn't have to drill any holes in any walls. Now, that one costs about 70 bucks. It's a pretty fancy one. If you count up the $5 connectors on there, you probably can't build it yourself for that. And notice, it even includes a feed-through for your ground. That's important. That is a pretty slick little product. Now, let's get radio shopping. Oh, the fun part. Let's face it, modern HF radios are absolutely amazing. Here's one now. This is the ICOM IC7851. That is one beautiful piece of technology. It costs about $12,500. It's gorgeous, unless you catch it on sale. Now look at all the knobs and buttons on that thing. I counted. I actually sat down and counted. There are 97 knobs and buttons on the front of that radio. But I might have lost count somewhere in the middle of counting them. You don't need that radio. You don't want that radio. That is a Steinway. You still need to learn how to play chopsticks, okay? Let me gently remind you that many years ago, hams all over the world were communicating with each other absolutely fine with radios that looked a lot like this. That's the venerable Collins KWM2. It's a radio with a total of 10, count them 10, knobs and switches on the front, and that includes the on-off switch. I'm not advising you that you run out to the swap meet here and find yourself a KWM2 for your shack, but I am pointing out that you honestly don't need every bell and whistle on a modern transceiver at the top of the line. I hope some of you will help me escape the fairgrounds after this presentation, because the vendors over there are probably going to try to lynch me out here in the square, but you really don't need that $12,000 radio. You can get an amazing radio for under $1,000 if you watch the sales. Most of the major makers make good, solid, entry-level HF radios that are going to be more than adequate for your present needs. Here's an Alinco. It's a DX-SR82. List price about $500, brand spanking new. It has a tuning knob, a volume knob, squelch, RIT, and IF shift even, and it covers 160 through 10 meters. We just had one operating at our 7QP. It was a backup radio somebody brought, and it chugged right along and it did its job. In fact, it kept going when one of the more spendy radios that we had up pooped out about halfway through the afternoon. Now, for another about $150, you can step up to Yaesu's FT891. It covers 160 through 6 meters. It's a very compact radio. So many functions require stepping through the unit's menus, but the payoff is small size and a lot of features. Now, some people love these things, some people hate them. I've run into very few who are in the middle of them. If you master the menu system, this radio is a killer, but some people just hate stepping through menus. Here's an ICOM IC718, $625. You have to look to find these. It's about the same as the FT891, but a little less menu driven. Now, if you're up for a little risk, you can always go out here to the flea market and find something like this gem, this Kenwood TS820S. This happened to belong to a friend of mine, and we caught it at a swap meet. The note on the top explains all the things that you kind of have to adjust your operating for, because a few things are slightly malfunctioning on this radio. But hey, for $250 you're in business, and it makes RF. I'd advise you, if you're going the used route, stay as local as possible, or at least face to face. I've heard way too many horror stories about eBay, ham radio transactions to recommend those to you. You want to see that thing at least light up and make some noise. It's even better if you can test the transmit side on a dummy load with a watt meter. Then you know you're buying a radio, not a project. The last major item that'll probably be on your list, depending on the antenna choice you make, is an antenna tuner. That's the MFJ, the venerable 949E. They claim that's the most popular tuner in the world. I'm sure they still have a few in boxes. Has lots of range, plenty of power handling capacity, 300 watts, and a new one will set you back about $200. For about $50 less, you can get this little travel tuner, which does the same thing. Also handles 300 watts. There you go. You got your antenna, your feed line, your radio, maybe a power supply, and maybe a tuner. Yes, ma'am, you had a hand up? Can't hear you. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, it's more MFJ stuff. I'm in pain. I'm hurting because of MFJ, because Martin gave me blanket permission to use any picture on their website for anything I needed. So our books are full of MFJ stuff. So I'm going to have to find new pictures. Anybody want to move to Starkville, Mississippi? Got a few $1,000,000 in your pocket? Yes, ma'am. Maybe. Depends on your antenna choice. So I've got an ICOM 746 at home, and it'll handle about 3-to-1 SWR, and then it's out of range. So if I put, and by the way, it does just fine with our 43. But if I was looking at something that was kicking bigger SWRs, I'd need an external tuner. And frankly, they're just nice to have anyway, and they're not that expensive. Okay, let's play radio. Fire this thing up. Okay, yes sir. Somebody help me here. Oh, power supply. Yeah, well, there's not much sexy to say about power supplies. You've got basically two choices. You've got switch mode power supplies, which are small and light, fit easily into your shack, can be noisy. Okay, if you're going to get a switch mode power supply, and they're not a bad choice, it's what we've got in our shack, you want to be sure you get one that's for ham radio, because they are inherently insanely noisy in RF interference. So get one that's properly shielded and designed for ham radio. They'll cost you a little more. You don't want the $29.95 eBay power supply. It's not going to work out well for you. You're just going to have a lot of noise in your shack, and noise is a big enough problem. So then the other choice is a center tap, one of the good old Amtrons, or we have one for our HF operation. The little switch mode feeds our VHF, UHF, and you can always tell that you've got a center mode because it feels like it's got two bowling balls in it, because that transformer is huge in there. So I like those. They're quiet, they're big, they're heavy. So it's your choice on power supplies. Just buy enough to run what you need to run. Better to have too much power supply than not enough. Okay, so we're going to play radio. What are we going to do? Oh, we don't know. Well, very broadly speaking, there are three families of modes widely available on the HF band. So CW, SSB phone, and digital modes. I don't mean to shortchange any of the other modes, such as AM or slow scan TV, but those are more specialized than what we'll cover here. We're going to fly over CW pretty quickly. I suspect if someone is motivated enough to learn CW, that someone is not probably in this room. CW is particularly useful in these days of difficult propagation. Almost nothing punches through like CW. You also find a different crowd of people in the CW world. It's just different from SSB. There are a lot of ways to learn CW. If you're interested, my personal favorite is the CW Academy. I just did their beginner course and I had a ball, and it's free. You won't run across the trash talking and stuff you can find in a few spots on the bands if you're working CW. But your radio has a knob, you can easily avoid that stuff. You twist the big knob and the nasty stuff goes away. By the way, somebody pointed out to me, it's easy to get started in contesting even if you have a little mic fright. Just jump in and start, and if you mess it all up, twist the knob really fast and you'll disappear. Nobody will know who you were. That was hilarious and so obvious. All right, single sideband phones, probably the most popular mode on HF, and there are lots of different ways to use single sideband: contests, nets, DXing, and what we'll call point and shoot, where you tune around until you find some human being out there and then you start a contact with them. I'd suggest a good starting point is nets. There are lots and lots of them on all the bands. I did a quick search the other day for 75-meter nets on the ARRL's net directory search. I turned up 144 nets. When I searched all bands, I got 420. Some are specialized, like there's the Medical Reserve Corps net that only fires up on an as-needed basis, and others are just y'all come on a very regular schedule, some of them even daily. Now, those 144 that I found on 75 meters are wide coverage nets. When you look regional or local on more bands, you'll find even more. There's lots of nets. The reason I suggest nets is because you can look up exactly where they'll be when. so you know what frequency to tune in. You're not going to be hunting for a long time. You pick a likely looking suspect for you, tune in and listen until you get the hang of it, and then check in, and away you go. You've started talking on the radio. And do listen from the start of the net, because that's where they explain how to participate. Now, how to speak fluent HF. It's something like this, so you might want to copy this down. Just carry on. I know when you do your license training, it seems like there must be all kinds of specialized language for HF, but there are some differences and a little bit of vocabulary to learn, but let me set your mind at ease. I think you'll pick up the general idea really quickly. You keep a cheat sheet of the Q codes close at hand. We sell a ham radio fax book that has every Q code in the world in it. That's a little reference we wrote mostly for ourselves, frankly. Pay attention to the flow of the net and what people are saying. You'll be up to speed in very little time. Formal nets provide a structured environment that can be great for a beginner. You know when to talk, you know basically what sort of communication is expected, and you have a sense of kind of the rhythm of the net. I don't suggest you jump right into contesting unless you have a good Elmer by your side. Or you do the, I better disappear, twist the knob fast thing, which is fine. That's what happened to that person that you're still sitting there going, what happened to him? You'll get your skills up to speed quickly enough when you play that game, but some of the players in contesting take it very seriously, and they will get very crabby and grumpy if you don't follow the exact procedures. And heaven help you if you don't log the contact and log it quickly. Let's face it, some people kind of lose their minds when they get into a competition. So don't slow down their pace, or worse, fail to log. Oh my gosh, the LOTW, Logbook of the World, went down a couple of days ago, and I was talking to Mike Ritz from the ARRL. He said that's all they were doing was fielding calls from DX operators. I need to see that log! No, you'll be fine. It'll come back up in a couple of days. A point and shoot is great if you have a little more patience and you don't care so much about the structured environment of a net. Your best bet is to try to tag on to the end of another conversation. Your way to do that is you wait till it seems like the conversation's over, and then you say your call sign. That's it. And the person will either come back to you or not. But given your basic setup, if you can hear them, they can probably hear you. You'll be able to tell from the conversation that just ended what type of operation that operator is into at the moment. So if all the contact that you heard was name, call sign, location, or maybe the weather or something, but like really short, that person is collecting contacts, and that's all they want from you. If, on the other hand, they covered the weather, politics, what happened at Dayton, how, one convention was so much better 80 years ago than it is today, or whatever they're talking about, those are rag chewers, and you need to be prepared to have some conversation with those folks. That's what they're into. There are lots of HF digital modes, many designed for special purposes. I'll touch on two of the most popular. One is more of a chat mode. It's more like RTTY or like AOL Instant Messenger, if you're old enough to remember that. A more social mode, if you will. And the other one is wildly efficient and strictly about call sign, signal report, 73, good day, and on to the next contact. So chat modes are keyboard to keyboard, that's what we call them. Contact modes have limited conversation. So let's talk about setting up for digital. You're going to need a computer running a reasonably modern operating system. You don't need any kind of high-end computer. You set up the free software, most of it. You can just download from the net. Our laptop probably has a CPU made of balsa wood, and it does just fine on FT8, so you don't need to go buy a new computer. The computer has to get audio to and from the transceiver. That's how the whole thing works. So the headphone output of the computer is running into the microphone input of the transceiver. The headphone output of the transceiver is running into the microphone input of the computer. Now, a fellow who does the technician stuff or the technical stuff here probably just had a little flinch when I said that, because those inputs don't match up with the outputs. The levels are wrong. And that's why, even though we teach you this in the license manuals, this is science fiction. I don't know anybody who runs this way. What they get is a little translator box that goes in the middle that matches up the levels. That's made by a company called Signal Link. They're in Oregon. There are other boxes that do the same thing. Now that your computer and radio can communicate with each other, the next step is get the right software running. For the first mode that we'll talk about, PSK31, FLDigi is some free software for that mode, as well as some others. Ham Radio Deluxe, they're in this building 2 over here, I think. They also do a PSK31 package. It's a little more deluxe. If you're not familiar with Ham Radio Deluxe, it's quite an amazing software package. It does your logging, it handles multiple digital modes, it integrates with the WSJT software, and a whole lot more, and it's $99.95. Ridiculous. For the very weak signal modes that are popular at the moment, including FT8, it's the WSJT-X suite of software. That's a free program. Here's PSK31. This is what it looks like. It's a chat mode. You'll get used to all the misspellings and shortenings that go on there very quickly. Let's see, I'm trying to catch up on time here. Oh, then we get to FT8. As a technical achievement, FT8 is absolutely amazing. If PSK31 is a weak signal mode, FT8 is an invisible signal mode. You can literally get a message across when the signal is below the noise floor. That should not be possible, and yet it is. So it works great. These are the guys who invented it, Steve Franke and Joe Taylor. That's why it's FT, Franke Taylor, and 8 has to do with the number of tones that it uses to pass the messages. Now here's a screenshot of operating FT8. All the activity on the band that we're tuned into is on the left, and when it's live, you'll see incoming calls come in on the bottom. If you squint, you can see that WA6GXQ is calling CQ. It's here second from the bottom. If I double click on that, my computer will take over and it will try to make a contact with that person. That's it for that's my work. It's done. It will step through all the messages it has automatically until I go to the next contact. You need a good clock for FT8, and so you can go on a site called time.is, time.is, and it'll tell you how far off your computer is. You need to be within about, I think, 5 seconds of accurate in order to do that. Windows 10 and up do a good job of staying accurate with internet time, so your computer's just fine if you're running that. FT8 transmits for 15 seconds and then it listens for 15 seconds, and that's why your clock has to be accurate, because it has to know what time to send your message. All right, attention perfectionists, I need to talk to you before we get out of here. I know you folks, you're very concerned that you're going to make errors and everybody is going to know you're a beginner. Thanks, noob. Well, brace yourself. You are going to make mistakes. You are going to sound like a beginner. And if you have any sense at all, you will laugh like crazy and keep operating. That's what makes a ham. The good news is fully 95.2% by scientific survey of all hams are good-humored and very forgiving, especially if they know that you're new to this aspect of the hobby. As for that other 4.8%, well, you weren't going to make them happy anyway. Nothing you could do would make them happy. So they'll survive their traumatic encounter with you, and somehow they'll carry on. Forget about perfection, folks. This hobby is about fun. Do not let the perfect be the enemy of good enough. Ham radio, I tell you, is about good enough. Okay, thank you so much for being here. Here's my final message to you. Get on the radio, have some fun, and do wonderful things. Thanks so much. Now, everything I covered here is available in our little book, which the title was suggested to us by a, let's say, an education chairman. He said, what you ought to write is the fast track to finally getting on the blankety-blank air. Well, we left out the blankety-blank part, but this is the fast track to finally getting on the air with ham radio. And we go through everything from how to install a mobile radio in your car to all the stuff I've covered in this presentation and a lot more about getting on HF. We have a glossary in the back of all those foreign weird amateur radio terms, including all the HF gibberish, special language, and Q signs and all that good stuff. So it's kind of a fun book. It's $15. I have a few of them up here. We also have them at our booth in Building 1, which is Building 1908, or Booth 1908. Thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry I'm 5 minutes over, but enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.